Поскольку тут явно старые правила не работают, новых нет.
Since obviously we see that old rules do not work and fragmentation is taking place on the total scale, so I'll take the rule into my hands. Although that's something that I don't want, but I feel that I need to do that. Otherwise, we will never start. My name is Leonid Grigoriev. The majority of those present here know me. Well, I'm moderator by chance. Our true moderator that was supposed to be here is ill, so I will be a replacement and will just interlace my Russian words with English. I will introduce myself later when I'll take the floor, but now as in the shoes of the moderator, I decided that I would make a joke so that everybody's get focused after the first session. So my impression of the first session was that the best start for the beginning is in the old joke. I'm not paranoid, but that doesn't mean that nobody is watching me. So because the elites behave rather inadequately, I believe. But to transfer it to economics, I'll read a list of 10 words in English. So we're on the economic session now. So I will zombing the audience, transferring from politics to economics. Recovery, credit crunch, energy prices, migration, budget deficit, low investment, climate, debt crisis, millennium goals, short sources, short-term decisions, long-term objectives, sanctions, and sanctions. And now, I'll give the floor, and it's my pleasure to give the floor to Lord Robert Kidelsky. The floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much. The first session talked a lot about the changing rules of international relations. I want to concentrate on one key source of change, which hasn't been really mentioned properly, and that is the rise of the democratic theory of international relations and think a bit about its consequences. I mean, in the past, there have been two models that have dominated our thinking about international relations. One was the sort of power model, and the second, the commercial model. And the first was a competitive one, the second more a cooperative one. The first had more of a zero-sum game feel to it, and the second was much more a cooperative one. Of course, like all models, these are ideal types, and there were elements of both, always in practice. I mean, but in the 20th century, a third model has arisen, which is the democratic model. And the question I want to consider is what impact that's had on the way we think about international relations and the conduct of international relations. First, of course, the power model was a state-based model. States seek to maximize their power, and we have developed various mechanisms for restraining them, the key mechanisms being the balance of power, the Westphalian system, based on the sovereignty of states, and also part of that was international law deriving from Grotius. And in this sort of model, economics and ideology are simply weapons in the struggle for power. And political scientists have used that kind of model to explain what happened in the Cold War. Peace was maintained by a balance of terror plus the UN Charter. And this balance then disappeared after 1990. Now, slightly less familiar, because more economists talk about this, is the commercial model. And here the unit of analysis is the individual and not the state. The interests of selfish individuals may well be competitive, but, as Adam Smith wrote, human beings have a natural propensity to truck, barter, and exchange, and so their interests can be aligned with each other through the invisible hand of the market. In a free trade system, people cooperate to their mutual advantage. The douceur of commerce supersedes, at least modifies, the struggle for power. And in the commercial model, welfare is emphatically divorced from the struggle for territory and resources. And in this model, resources devoted to war and armaments are simply resources subtracted from the welfare of people. Now, this model can be challenged even in its own terms. This model that commerce produces cooperation, even in its own terms, it can be challenged. It presupposes fully competitive markets, and it ignores crashes, manias, panics, rivalries, inequalities, domestic and international, which have punctuated the rise and dominance of commerce and contradict the ideal model of commercial cooperation. Now, the democratic model, which is really what I want to focus on. This is here the unit of analysis is peoples, not individuals or states, but peoples. And at the heart of this model is the claim that democracy is the peaceful form of the state. And the crux of this claim is the supervision of rulers by citizens who have no interest in fighting, voters whose disposition is inherently peaceful, and therefore they can restrain the self-aggressive tendencies of rulers. Democracy subordinates the interests of the government or the ruler to the interests of the people. And it's thus a powerful restraint on the interstate struggle for power. And in conjunction with commerce and the rule of law, it tilts the balance of international system towards cooperation rather than competition. Or so it is claimed. Now, I just want to examine this claim. First, and most obviously, a lot depends on what one means by democracy. The accountability of governments to people in regular, free, and competitive elections is a feature of Western or constitutional democracy. It's not true of what Fareed Zakaria has called illiberal democracies, those whose essence lies in the mobilization of people by extreme nationalist or religious fanaticism. So democracy itself is an ambiguous term. Insofar as all forms of democracy strengthen legitimacy, it could be said that illiberal democracies may be much more warlike than the traditional forms of autocratic rule. And that's obviously true of much of the Middle East. But secondly, there's a contradiction which has been mentioned, between democracy and globalization. Voters control governments, but governments don't control international finance. And the chief recent example of that is the banking collapse and the austerity programs to which it gave rise. And the rise of extremist parties in Europe is a symptom of the disenchantment of voters with forces, economic forces, which they believe are beyond their control, but which they feel they ought to control. Now, the third element of democracy, which hasn't been mentioned, I think, is that democracies have a strong tendency to moralism, and moralistic democracies are not necessarily peaceful. It's true that Western democracy, if it's true that Western democracy is the peaceful form of the state, is it not the duty of democracies to spread democracy round the world by force, if necessary, in order to protect themselves against attack from non-democracies? As Tony Blair said, notably in Chicago in 1999, the spread of our values makes us all more secure. It could be argued that the quest for security through the spread of democracy, or human rights, which comes much to the same thing, is now the main aim of Western foreign policy, made possible by the collapse of the old USA-USSR balance and the emergence of the so-called unipolar moment. Now, faced with the sort of messianic goals of moralistic democracy, non-Western states like Russia and China have made multipolarity their official foreign policy doctrine. And both countries, without a past history of cooperation, have drawn together with other BRICS to create some of a pole of resistance, if you like, to Western messianism. The problem is that Russia and China, even acting together, and even allowing for the fact that China is a rising power, cannot hope to establish a new global balance against the United States and its European allies. Now, there's much to discuss in all this, especially the claim by Michael Hart and Antonio Negri that universal empire, an empire of the Western mind and Western-dominated multilateral institutions, is the postmodern form of international relations, a Fukuyama end of history in which civilized states no longer fight each other but fight terrorists and criminals. I mean, that's the sort of vision of that universal empire which came out of the end of the Cold War. And before post-communist Russia fell out with the United States, I think President Putin was quite attracted by that vision and looked forward to a partnership between Russia and the West to fight Islamic extremism. But he underestimated the messianic urge of the West to spread the whole package of Western values and the refusal of partnership to those states who didn't buy the whole package. And that was his disenchantment. If multipolarity is still a geopolitical myth, as I think it is in my view, there's a more solid intellectual basis for Russian policy, which is almost never mentioned. It's sort of almost a forbidden word, but it is a theory of international relations, a partial theory of international relations, and that is the Monroe Doctrine. You will recall that President Monroe stated in 1823 that efforts by European powers to colonize or interfere with states in North or South America would be viewed as acts of aggression, requiring American intervention. Three elements of the doctrine: separate spheres of influence for the United States and Europe, non-colonization, and non-intervention. And in return, the United States promised not to interfere in the affairs of Europe. This doctrine has never been officially repudiated by the United States. In fact, it was strengthened by Theodore Roosevelt, who transmuted it into the right of U.S. to military intervention anywhere in Latin America. And of course, this was applied during the Cold War in Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. Its Cold War counterpart on the Soviet side was the Brezhnev Doctrine. This was a sphere of influence, theory of international relations, over which was, under the shadow of the global balance of terror. In effect, I think Russia is claiming a Monroe Doctrine for the old Soviet space. It claims a historical sphere of influence. Significantly, it defines the frontiers of the old Soviet Union as the strategic frontiers of the Russian Federation. I mean, that is official doctrine. Now, this claim is historically understandable, but it is incompatible with the current norms of international relations based on national sovereignty and the rule of law. I mean, that seems to me completely inescapable. It's thus a potent source of continuing conflict between Russia and the West. I'm coming to an end here. Now, Russia may be able to maintain a kind of Monroe Doctrine in its old space, but at the cost of its quasi-permanent estrangement from the dominant multilateral institutions of the world system. It means a retreat from the cooperative logics of globalization and fighting terrorism. Now, the West may disintegrate, but it is under no urgent compulsion to alter its own norms. So the choice is Russia's, actually. So which way will it go? It either has to abandon Monroe Doctrine thinking, or it faces a future which is not really part of the world community, the majority of the world community. And I finished that. Thank you.
Спасибо огромное.
Thank you very much. So we'll be moving forward. Peter Arvin. Okay. Good afternoon. I'm one of the rare in this room who represent, maybe the only one who represents the private Russian business. Lately, much was spoken, and for instance, Sergei Pugachev in Financial Times wrote that Russian business primarily depends on the governments that we are the крепостные slaves of Putin. That's not. I disagree with that. We have a large independent private sector that lives independently of Russian politics, and it is absolutely not true that Russian oligarchs and tycoons interfere in politics, not at all, especially in the foreign policy. We do not exert any influence on politics. At least we are not willing to do that. We heard a lot from the West that business and politics are different things. They should be apart. And that's what we try to do. We believe that the state, the government is responsible for the state, and that should be independent of business. We believe that we should not exert any power on that, on the state, on the governments. But the latest events of the past 6 months just show that this is something not possible anymore. We are not under any sanctions, but nevertheless, the regime of sanctions has its say on our business. As a bank leader, we see that many Western banks stop their operations and interaction with us. They reduce their limits, referring to compliance. There's a number of European countries, and nearly all banks from them stop working with us, with the Russian businesses. And that shows that to work or not to work is a political decision. It is much more expensive now to borrow money from the West, and we feel this mode of sanctions dearly, and it's much more difficult for us to work abroad as well. It is practically impossible now. There's a myth that Russian investments had equal preference regime in the West, and as well as other countries, but we quite often were denied this possibility just because on the basis that we were from Russia. The investment climate of inflow, importing investments is much more favorable for that than exporting investments. But I believe that is not being very fruitful for sides. But what we see now is undermining of the connections that were established over the past 20 years. And that means that there's no possibility given for long-term relationship. Certain banks, we can cooperate with certain bank X, but then if we see that because of sanctions it stops working with us, then, well, that's a bit difficult for us. The response to the change of political climates towards business is something unproductive. It's not only unproductive for the Western side, for our Western partners, because that it has negative impact on their economic growth and doesn't contribute to anything good. We worked with Leonid for several years in the government, and what is a common ground now? We didn't know what it means. But over the past few years, a business culture was formed, and it is present here, but in the East and in the West. It's a multinational.
You can discuss business with anyone. This is something that brings us together. So I believe that to try to destroy such elements of rapprochement is counterproductive. Much like visa limitations is a problem, you always have to have areas that are not connected with politics, which are the only basis of long-term cooperation, long-term understanding. The entire logic of what's going on is quite strange. If we talk about investments, for example, today, all Russian companies fundamentally are limited in investing abroad in other countries. And the point is, sanctions should deteriorate the economic situation in Russia. That's why we will not allow you to invest abroad. They're not, but it's the opposite. We already invest in Russia, but they're not allowing us to invest in abroad. If we invest everything in Russia, then it will improve the situation in Russia, not deteriorate it. So it's a illogical decision. But again, as I said, this mix between business and political interests is highly counterproductive, and in the long-term perspective, it's very dangerous, because when you have to finally normalize everything, this will play its negative role. Thank you. Our next presenter is Professor Brahman Cheleni, Harmamark Center of Policy Research, Harmakyapuri. Am I right?
I wish to make 4 points on the theme of this session, which is cooperation versus competition. And I'll begin with an obvious point. We live in a rapidly changing world. The pace of technological change since the advent of the information age in the 1980s has been truly revolutionary. As a result, technological forces now are playing a greater role in shaping international geopolitics than at any other time in history. Economically, the rapid pace of change in technology, coupled with reduced transportation costs and lower trade barriers, has accelerated global GDP growth and also contributed to the rise of the East. Geopolitically, the pace of change has been no less extraordinary. Since the late 1980s, the world has been dramatically transformed in a geopolitical sense. We have witnessed the most profound geopolitical change in the most compressed time frame in history. This brings me to my second point about our increasingly interdependent world. The British writer Rudyard Kipling wrote, "East is east, and west is west, and the twain shall never meet." But now they meet in an increasingly interdependent world. For example, Western economies increasingly are dependent on cash inflows from the cash-laden economies of the East. Globalization has promoted two separate processes: the denationalization of production, with different stages of production geographically separate, leading to the formation of value chains internationally, and the denationalization of consumption, allowing consumers to buy products and services from places where they can be produced more cost effectively. The world is becoming more interdependent, not just in trade and capital flows. The interdependencies also extend to the technological, public health, environmental, and climate spheres. To give you just one example, deforestation and environmental degradation on the Tibetan Plateau also affects atmospheric general circulation in Russia, Europe, and North America. Atmospheric general circulation is a system of winds that helps transport warm air from the equator to the higher latitudes, creating different climate zones in the process. The Tibetan Plateau, with its towering height, it's the world's highest and largest plateau. The Tibetan Plateau affects atmospheric general circulation across the northern hemisphere. Take another example of global interdependence: the mobility of technical expertise across international frontiers. Global pandemics, as illustrated by the current Ebola crisis, serve as yet another example of global interdependence. But these interdependencies have not brought the world closer together. Rather, the interdependencies have only sharpened competition between and among important players. In this context, the struggle for natural resources has set off sharpening geopolitical rivalries among some of the great powers. Russia is not involved in this struggle for resources because, as you know, Russia is and will remain for the foreseeable future the world's wealthiest country in natural resources. But historically, access to resources has been an important factor in war and peace. The rise of Portugal in the 15th century or the subsequent emergence of Pax Britannica was made possible by a nimble navy that secured vital commodities from distant resource-rich lands. Gaining access to resources has been an important driver of many of the armed interventions and wars of the 19th and 20th centuries. In fact, the first invasion and occupation of the 21st century, that of Iraq by the United States, also had a resource dimension. Today, the sharpening geopolitical competition over natural resources has exacerbated interstate disputes over resource-rich territories. Take the disputed islands in the South and East China Seas. These disputed islands together occupy a land area of just 11 square kilometers. In other words, all these disputes between different parties are over a land size of just 11 square kilometers. But it's the seas surrounding these islands that supposedly hold rich hydrocarbon reserves beneath the seabed. Africa today has become the new theater of a great game over resources. One dimension of this great game over resources is farmland acquisitions by foreign governments and agribusiness firms. Some 20 states in sub-Saharan Africa have sold or leased fertile land measuring more than double the size of Britain to foreign governments and firms. These acquisitions are more than land grabs. They are, in fact, also water grabs because they're designed to grow food for foreign markets with local water resources. Another dimension of this great game in Africa is infrastructure development by foreign governments. As during the European imperial era in Africa, infrastructure development by foreign governments on that continent is driven by one specific interest: resource extraction and export. Take the construction of dams in Africa by foreign governments. In fact, all the dams currently under construction in Africa are being built by one foreign government alone. These dams are designed to generate electricity, to facilitate extraction, processing, and export of minerals. My third point relates to the changing international order. The age of Atlantic dominance is in slow retreat. With just 12% of the world's population living in the West, the post-World War II transatlantic order has to give way to a more international order. In fact, today's manifold global challenges and major power shifts symbolize the birth pangs of a new world order. While we know the international order is in transition, the contours of the new order are still not visible. Yet, the major power shifts make fundamental reforms in the existing global institutional structure inevitable. The international institutional structure has remained static since the mid-20th century, even as the world has changed fundamentally. A 21st century world cannot remain saddled with 20th century institutions and rules. My fourth and final point is about the future of the international structure. And here I come to the theme of this Waldai conference, new rules or no rules. Will it be a rules-based order or an order anchored in classical balance of power politics? The alternative to a rules-based order is an order in which international law is just a tool for the powerful against the weak. Geoeconomics is not dictating geopolitics, contrary to the predictions of some pundits when the Cold War ended. In fact, politics, to a large measure, still drives economics, with political risk dominating the financial markets and sanctions being used as a political barrier to free trade. Yet it has become fashionable to talk about a 21st century world that is governed by rules. Who will determine these rules to ensure fair play and to prevent competition from sliding into confrontation? Which institutions will enforce the rules? Unless these issues are not settled, the powerful states will continue to cite international law to the weaker states, but ignore it when it comes in their way. Chairman Mao famously asserted that power grows out of the barrel of a gun. In the 21st century, will power still grow out of the barrel of a gun? The answer to that will depend on how this question that is posed by this conference gets answered. To conclude, the larger implications of the ongoing developments for international peace and security remain unclear. For example, the assertive pursuit of national interest for relative gain in an increasingly interdependent world is hardly a recipe for a more harmonious world. The architecture of global governance that evolves will help determine how the world handles its pressing international challenges. The way major powers play international politics may explain why the present international system is centered both on rules and balance of power. This blend of rules and balance of power may likely characterize also the emerging international order, because when several great powers vie for influence and for relative advantage, balance of power becomes less of a choice and more of a certainty. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you.
Gandhi, Senior Fellow with Brookings Institution. Go ahead.
Thank you, Leonid. It's a pleasure to be on the panel with the distinguished speakers you've heard, and I think my remarks will build on some of the points of each of them. Professor Skidelsky talked about the cost of Russia attempting to pursue a Monroe Doctrine. That was exactly what Piotr Aven was referring to in talking about the sanctions, counterproductive and dangerous. exactly the point I want to make. And finally, Professor Chilani talking about how politics, geopolitics in today's world dominates economics, and taking the sanctions as an example of that. I've just been recently reading a book, I haven't finished it, I started it, that I still think I can recommend, about World War I. And there have been several people referring to this anniversary of 100 years since World War I. This book is The Sleepwalkers. The title alludes to the idea of actors taking actions, short-sighted actions, prior to World War I, unaware of the monumental consequences that these actions would have. Had they known the consequences, they presumably would have behaved differently, but of course you can only say that in hindsight. I fear very much that for all the failures to make a correct analogies between World War I and the situation today 100 years later, there is an element of sleepwalking in the policies of key players in today's world, and not least in my country, the United States, on the part of the designers, the architects of this policy of sanctions as a means of trying to influence the behavior of the Putin regime of the Russian Federation. I want to talk about exactly the consequences, the sleepwalking aspect of this, the idea the consequences are not appreciated of these sanctions. But before I get to the consequences, I want to just quickly give the background by addressing three other points about the sanctions. First is the impact of the sanctions, the damage that they do. The second is the logic behind the sanctions. How are they intended? What's the mechanism by which they're supposed to achieve their goal? And the third is the effect of the sanctions, effect being defined here as to what extent do they work. And I separate, and I'll get to that, between impact, the damage they may cause to the Russian economy, and the effect, which may or may not be related to that damage. Typically, people just focus on the impact, and they assume that that means they're working. I think Peter Oven was suggesting the contrary, and I'll emphasize that. But then I'll come to the consequences of this sanctions policy, that is, the future consequences for Russia and for the world. So quickly, Peter Oven has defined, I think, or outlined the disastrous effects of these sanctions in the financial and banking sphere, and that's where it's all about. It's in the financial sphere that the sanctions have been most damaging. He correctly pointed out, and who is a better authority than he, to describe that effectively all Russian potential borrowers, people who need financial flows, have been cut off from outside sources of financing. And this includes Europe. This includes also China, by the way, to a large extent is still subject to this. Why is that? Obviously, China has not signed on to the formal sanctions that the European Union and the United States have against Russia. But these sanctions inscribed in documents are what are referred to as the core sanctions, the formal core sanctions. Perhaps much more significant is the gray zone, as people have described it. The areas in which, though they're not even included in the formal sanctions, banks in the West and other institutions in the West refrain from engaging at all with potential Russian clients for fear that either their area may later be included in an expanded range of sanctions, or the very fact that it is a somewhat gray zone that may subject them to legal action or attempts at legal action by especially the US authorities. The phrase that is often used, and as I've talked to business people from both the Russian side, but especially from the Western side, is that Russia, the Russian brand, the word Russia, has become radioactive. You don't dare get near it. But what's significant about something being radioactive, the term radioactive. It's the fear factor. It engenders almost hysterical fear that you don't even want to get close to it, and that's what's happening this. And this fear, this radioactive nature of dealing with Russia is, by the way, consciously promoted by certain U.S. actors to achieve this effect of making Russia radioactive in terms of being off limits. Second point is the logic. How are these designed to work? Now, I'm not talking about the purpose. What are they designed to achieve? Because I am not clear about this, and I know that different actors in the U.S. and in Europe have different objectives. Let me just say it quickly. It's ultimately about altering Russia's behavior, of course. But the question is, are you trying to alter Russia's behavior specifically with respect to Ukraine, and possibly an extension to the Baltic states or wherever else you might be trying to deter Russia? Or, that's one interpretation. The other is that it's designed to weaken Russia to the point that Russia will not attempt to overthrow the post-Cold War order, that Russia would become the Russia of the 1990s, unable to object to anything that was done in a much more fundamental sense than specifically the Ukraine purpose. And I'm quite aware that there are people who subscribe to that second thing. But in either case, the point is you're trying to change Russia. The logic of how this is different people have different logic, but one, and I think the one that's primarily driving this, especially in the financial sector sanctions, is exactly what Peter Oven described. They're targeted at Russian business. They're targeted specifically at what are being described as the cronies of Putin, oligarchs who supposedly Putin benefits from, ultimately driven by an argument on the part of those architects of the sanctions that the primary motive for what Putin does is greed, and if we can hit him in the pocketbook, he will pull back. This, of course, I think is wrong. But it does help us understand why there's been virtually no effect of the sanctions. That was my point. You've had a huge impact, but the effect, have you changed Russia's behavior? I don't think so. Effect differs from impact. And there are two reasons why, despite the huge impact, the effect has been minimal. First, of course, most fundamental is what are the motivation for an actor, for a state to engage in the activity that you're trying to prevent. If it's national survival, or if it's perceived as national survival, it doesn't matter what you do to them, they're going to fight. And that's, in my opinion, Russia's position on this. But the second reason that the impact, the damage, has so little effect on behavior is the nature of Russia's dual economy. Russia is truly a dual economy. The core, the basis, the foundation of Russia's economy is the one it inherited from the Soviet Union. The physical structure, the nature of production, everything. It's the old, if you like, dinosaurs of the Soviet period. There is overlaid on that, and to some extent separate from it, a new modern economy that has been extremely successful in adopting modern techniques, not modern technology, modern systems of organization, and has been highly integrated into the global economy. Economic warfare, read sanctions, by definition hits the integrated part of the Russian economy, the part of the economy that is integrated into the global economy. They can't operate other than that. So in other words, our sanctions are targeting the most progressive, most modern, most integrated part of the Russian economy. And that's just simple fact. You could have predicted that from the beginning. So that brings me finally to the consequences. First of all, for Russia, you're crippling Russia's most progressive modern sector economically. It also means that that sector and its representatives lose political voice. It slows the economy. Import substitution, which is the Russian reaction to the sanctions, is going to slow, ultimately, this economy. It may provide some short-term boost, but it's not a good thing. It's costly. It's inefficient. And it will conversely strengthen the more backward parts of the Russian economy. Now, of course, if I argue that to some people in the United States, they'd say, well, that's good. We want to weaken the Russian economy, so if you're telling me the Russian response of import substitution will weaken the Russian economy, they would say that's good. I don't think that's good. The consequences for the world, finally, most important, really, is that Russia's reaction to this is to reduce its vulnerability, its exposure to these sanctions. The most important and the most damaging sanctions are in the financial sector. Therefore, Russia adopts steps to make its own financial sector independent of the global financial system, trying to reduce its financial interdependence to become more autonomous financially. There is a bottom line to this. When Russia reduces its dependence on the international financial system, when we, the West, are compelling them to do that, we are reducing the cost to Russia to deploy the most dangerous weapon Russia has in a conflict. What is that weapon? What's the most dangerous weapon Russia has? Russia is a superpower, a military superpower in 3 dimensions. It has nuclear weapons, it's a nuclear superpower. It has the energy weapon, it's an energy superpower. It is a cyber superpower. It won't likely resort to nuclear weapons. Energy is actually a very ineffective, dull instrument as a use of economic warfare. It's good for intimidation and blackmail and other things. The most dangerous weapon that Russia has, and unfortunately the most likely, I'm not saying it is likely, but it is the most likely that it would deploy, would be the cyber weapon. And when I talk about cyber weapon and cyber warfare, I'm not talking about espionage, I'm not talking about information war, I'm not talking about controlling or protecting yourself against social networks and the internet. I'm not even talking about use of cyber warfare against the other country's military, sabotaging its command and control systems. The most dangerous application of Russia's cyber war, as anybody's would be, is against the international financial system, because the international financial system is completely vulnerable to cyber war, cyber attacks. The only real restraint, international agreements and so forth would be nice, but as you know, arms control agreements are only a reflection of an overall atmosphere of trust. The agreements themselves can't possibly restrain someone from action. The only restraint against the use of Russia's cyber war weapon against the international financial system is Russia's own dependence on that system. So that's my point, that if we reduce their dependence on the international financial system, there is a point at which Russia feels it has so much less to lose than we do, the West, in attacking that system that it would be tempted to do it. So that's, my point is exactly following up on what Peter's saying about the counterproductive nature of the sanctions regime, the sanctions policy, but maybe adding something that it doesn't seem to me people have been talking about very much. Thank you.
You want to ask immediately? Go ahead. I am very kind of moderator because I am not a legitimate moderator, so please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
Но только не деритесь.
I have just
Don't fight.
a question. My remark is that our issue is new rules or no rules. A rule is always general, sanction is always particular. And for that reason, a sanction destroys the rules. And I have a good example, I think, in history. The man who invested the most in his career, the chief of state, on sanctions was Napoleon. Napoleon made the continental blockade against the United Kingdom, and because he wanted to make it more efficient, he invaded Russia. And you know the end. So I think it's a historical, interesting example about sanctions on international relations. My question is that, as economist, I know that economic theory explains very well that sanctions are always bad for all partners. And why Western elites who are supposed to know economic theory show so much contempt towards these learnings?
Как мы собираемся? Вы будете отвечать. Just a second. Before we go to answer, please, if you're asking anybody in particular or the whole panel, indicate it, and please tell who you are. Because
Yes, my name is Yvan Blot from France.
Very good. Before we go to answer, let me remind you one fact which probably not all politicians know. The first official embargo against Russia was not at the time of Napoleon. Because invasion to Russia to make something efficient is definitely a wrong idea. The first idea of sanctions was in written form between King of Poland and King of Sweden. It was the time of Ivan III. It's about 1480. 1480. It's exactly 1 century before the number of the hotel. It was about strategic import of strategic materials to Russia. What was metals, silver, copper, everything. And Russians were smuggling. Russians always were cleverer than people who made sanctions. We were smuggling metals via Riga, pretending that's fruits. So now, please.
Well, so Professor Plo asked about sanctions interfere with free market transactions. That's the definition of them. The free market transactions would otherwise not have taken place unless they were mutually advantageous to both sides. So how can sanctions work? But of course, the argument there is, on the part of someone who adopts sanctions, is that yes, in principle, they affect both sides equally, but if you can concentrate the effect on the enemy's side in a way that damages their ability or willingness to conduct the war or the action that you're unhappy with, you design them in such a way. So it depends on who exactly is impacted. From the United States standpoint, I mean, it's been pointed out many times that the U.S., of course, is pushing very hard on these sanctions. We suffer very little from anything the Russians could do to us, and we don't suffer even from the effect of the sanctions. Our trade with Russia is low. So there are even economic arguments for why maybe sanctions might work, but that was really not my point. I think my point was that the consequences, the likely and potential consequences of these particular financial sanctions are so devastating relative to the ease with which they are adopted. And by the way, the incredibly small number of individuals in the US government itself that are administering them, that are responsible for them. This is what's particularly frightening to me, that there's been, this is an act that could have consequences on the scale of a nuclear attacks if my nightmare scenario of a cyber warfare were to emerge, and yet hardly anyone is discussing what these consequences might be. It is simply an incredibly convenient, easy tool for politicians to adopt in light of the fact, I mean, normally, if Russia were a normal country, we would have bombed them the same way we do with Libya or something, right? But you can't do that with Russia. Because Russia has, whatever, 8,000 nuclear weapons.
You mean only normal countries could be bombed?
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Normal bad countries. Yeah. So that's why you resort to sanctions in general, but specifically these financial sector sanctions are the really dangerous thing.
Could I make a brief comment on sanctions, or if you allow me?
Just a second. I have two news. One is good, one is bad. Good news, we asked 5 questions about 5 people in the first. Bad news, after that, I will take my 10 minutes as a speaker. Okay? Otherwise, by moderation, I'm deprived of extend talks. Please.
Well, my reaction is very, very quick. I think the object of sanctions is to impose costs which encourage the sanctioned country to change its policies. That we agree on. Now, they work either by imposing costs on the elite, which causes them to withdraw their support from the political leadership, or they work by imposing costs on the mass of the population, which causes a popular uprising. Those are two mechanisms by which sanctions may work. The historical record is very unclear. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But they both got to be considered. Here it's the costs on the elite that are the immediate object. Well, the elite is, well, how do they react?
Okay. Richard Sakwa, please. Professor Sakwa.
Yeah, Richard Sakwa, University of Kent. I just want to go to the question of the Monroe Doctrine. There's been a huge debate for 50 or longer about this. I don't want to be too technical, but simply to refer to Carl Schmitt in 1950 wrote a fantastic work called The Normals of the Earth, which basically argued that the idea of Monroe Doctrine of the 1820s in the United States effectively undermined the sovereignty of all the other, in that particular case of the Atlantic world, the West Atlantic, but in general of every country in the world, by announcing the fact that one state has this sort of right of prerogatives over the other. Now what has happened is that this idea has been universalized to the whole world. So in other words, that the political autonomy or political subjectivity of all sorts of states no longer already is, as it were, at a secondary level above those powers at the center of the system. Now, what we've been arguing, and lots of people have been arguing for a long time, and last year's Valdai in particular, was the argument that you could modify that by developing, in our case, a vision of European continentalism. We used to call it the European Union, which was going to emerge as a separate sort of political subjectivity, that it would be the core of a larger European identity, which would not repudiate the Atlantic community, but it would be separate from it. It would develop its own political subjectivity, its own rules, its own type of social democracy, even we used to believe in these sort of things, and all the rest. All of that is gone. And it's gone almost deliberately. The ability to develop continentalism, which was very much at the heart of the Putin system. Remember, in the early 2000s, he wanted to get closer to the European Union, and the Medvedev vision, which we talked about, an inclusive European security order. All of these things were precisely the repudiation of that Monroe Doctrine, if you like, which has become, in the form of international law, universalized to everybody. So the fundamental question then is, can we retrieve out of all of this some sort of European continentalism? I mean, sanctions precisely says we can't. All of this is designed to say that that vision of a common European home and all of those other ideas is over. We've got, for a long time, a new division of Europe, which sanctions is going to be one of the pillars of that. So in other words, the sanction regime, easy to impose, very hard to remove. So, I mean, the question ultimately, is it for 5 years, 10 years, 50 years? In other words, this division. And which also means political, it isn't just the post-Soviet states, but it means that everything becomes in the logic of geopolitical contestation in Europe and the world. Thanks.
I believe it was a statement, not a question.
Well, how long will sanctions last? Is that the bottom line?
Okay, we just tell numbers. How long? We are trying to answer just numbers. Anybody ready to tell the year of end for sanctions? I don't. I think it's forever.
Until the end of American dominance over Europe. It's going to be until the end of American dominance over Europe. Sanctions will end together with the end of this dominance.
Benedict, ты будешь говорить, когда я попрошу. Извини.
Benedict, you will speak when I ask you. Andronik, I didn't give you the floor, so please be disciplined, because we are the country of discipline, of democracy, and Andronik is no exception. You're an exception in New York, but not here.
Me already. Professor Grigoriev, you'll be pleased to know I was going to make 2 brief observations. I will make 1. And in response to the very compelling points made by Professor Cheleni. One of the key pillars of liberalism was that interdependence would diminish and alleviate political differences and harmonies. And what we have seen instead is that, although they've had some of these effects in some areas, they have become, interdependency has also become a new source of tension. And this is particularly the case where the parties to an interdependent relationship have different business cultures, legal cultures, and normative systems. You could see this over at least a 15-year period in the EU-Russia energy relationship. The EU, for understandable reasons, regards the third energy package as a belated affirmation of its own rules in its own normative space, and for equally powerful reasons, the Russian Federation regards the third energy package as a form of predatory behavior and theft. So I simply want to contribute that in reinforcement of what you have said.
Thank you very much. Please, Piotr. То есть третий пакет.
Well, the third package is the European doctrine of predator.
To Peter Raven, I really appreciate your contribution to this panel. Seems to me that Russia, by default, became the victim of its own success, because Russia became very open economies. It's 6 or 7 places as the most open economies in the world. So obviously, sanction hits in the most vulnerable aspect of Russian economy. So I agree with Cliff about this. But at the same time, I also believe that Russian business was living in the self-imposed illusion that business can be separated from politics. And the recent book by Haju Chang showed that even the most developed economies of United States, England, South Korea, were historically speaking driven by politics, not by the market. And the question is, in such a situation, what are possible reaction to the current situation? What are possible strategies for Russian business in face of Clifford says as a long-term damaging sanctions?
Спасибо. Мистер Качинс. Мы только быстро. Давай, Петя.
Вы правы. Мы...
Right. We live, I will answer in Russian. Well, we lived with illusions that we can be separated from politics, that we see that the West exerts even a stronger impact on business, but I don't believe that this is good. The idea of my message is that there should be delineation between politics and business, that there should be no political influence on business. I don't believe that business should be in politics like it was back in 1990s. So we should do everything possible to step away from this, and that's what we try to explain. It's counterproductive. This is not effective at all. This is wrong. Thank you, Mr. Kochins.
Thank you.
Leonid.
Grigoriev is not a Democrat. He doesn't give us floor. There are too many people who would like to take the microphone, so that's why I accelerate the process.
I'm happy to submit to your authority, Leonid. I think the sanctions are even worse than Peter and Cliff alluded to. And I'll make 2 comments, and I'd be interested to hear your response. But I should acknowledge that I became very anti-sanction at a young age. In 1980, when President Carter implemented various sanctions on the Soviet Union, including barring the United States from participating in the Moscow Olympics, I was outraged. I was at the time a track athlete. I was not good enough in the 400 meters to be a world-class athlete, but I was good enough to run against world-class athletes. And I thought it was totally counterproductive to deprive them of the opportunity to come to Moscow and kick ass. That would be the best way of demonstrating, I thought. But that aside, I see a very, very nefarious domestic political impact on the sanctions. I think there are signs of a reallocation of assets going on in Russia, and the impact of the sanctions is to encourage that, because it takes out Western individuals, Western institutions as potential arbiters to participate in that. And as some of us heard recently at the Brookings Institution, when an unnamed U.S. government official talked about sanctions, I mean, it was to fight against Putinism. Putinism. That term was used about 50 times in the course of half an hour. But it's encouraging Putinism, I fear, because the reallocation of the assets will go to those cronies that support Mr. Putin and will support Mr. Putin into perpetuity. So I'd be interested in hearing your response to that. The other aspect is more global. I mean, the ability for sanctions to be effective is based upon the domination of the US dollar in the global financial system. That domination is already eroding, I think, because of reasons of a changing economic balance of power that's been alluded to. But it's only going to incentivize countries like Russia, like China, like Brazil, India, anybody else to take steps to immunize themselves against the use of such sanctions, against potential use of these such sanctions against themselves. And so it will accelerate the erosion of the principal role the US dollar plays in the international financial system, which I think is probably not necessarily in most people's interests. And now I'll pass the microphone to my dear colleague.
Yes, please, Angela.
Thank you very much. Just a brief comment about the Monroe Doctrine. In this debate, particularly what you hear in Russia, that Russia's view of its near abroad is similar to America's view. From the US point of view, the Monroe Doctrine is very 20th century. If you look at of Latin America now, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Ecuador, I could go on. We are not surrounded by friendly countries. We have a number of our neighbors are extremely anti-American. It's just not an issue anymore. We have other greater threats. So this idea that this is an American sphere of influence and that justifies other countries having that doctrine, this is no longer an operative doctrine for the United States.
Okay, please, Nikit, вот туда, вот, товарищи в очках. Во-во-во-во-во-во.
Well, nobody's forgotten. Nobody's forgotten. I'm just moving across the line of rows. Well, I think that. Well, I should say that the way of moderating the sessions by Andrei Bystrisky and you is beyond any praise. Well, but you said that some regret concerning the financial sector, sanctions against the financial sector, but at the same time, you clearly said that, and you articulated the idea that sanctions in this or that form spread over our economy and finance even before that, all along the 1990s. In spite of openness that was stated, there were still some sanctions imposed on us. So we're speaking today about the world order that should take place. We mentioned breach of rules and maybe need to return to old rules. If that is, who should do that? You stated the current situation in the financial sector. In the major business, you said that. Well, my question is, what are the reasons that brought to the deterioration of the situation, and where do you see a way out of the situation, except for not mixing politics with business? Well, I will first answer the question, what are the conclusions? We will make no conclusions, actually, except for that analyzing thoroughly situations where countries where to invest and where we raise money. Many years ago, where West was not quite happy to work with us, our first investments were in Singapore and Taiwan. So we began to raise money through the eastern countries, because we see that European banks are quite apprehensive. So that's the first conclusion that we drew. Answering your question, I'm not ready. I'm not prepared to answer the question about the new forms of regulating. I have no ready-made answer to that. But I would insist that there should be a separation between business and politics, and there should be a unified position here and abroad. Those institutions, financial institutions that resist pressure should continue doing that. So we see quite different lines of behavior. Major banks, those that work with us continue doing that in spite of anything, and there are small banks that close under the pressure. But business should be guided by independent behavior, and this business reaction is something that we should be guided by. And this is something that the business community should profess. I have no other answers to that. What are the roots of that? Well, the traditional attitude towards Russia, even before that. Well, you know all that list of reasons. They are primarily political reasons, not economic reasons at all. Well, please pass the microphone. Give the microphone to Alexander Prohanov. I see everyone. I try to please everyone in the audience. Well, my question is also to Mr. Oven. From his presentation, I realized that lately the relationship between Russian business and politics was very pure and, so to say, maiden-like, or. But we see that the situation in Ukraine led to catastrophic position of Russian business, in particular the bank system. But the catastrophe that you are experiencing now, the collapse of a big sector as a result of that effort, does not tempt you to use your connections in high spheres to have at least some impact on Russian politics and just correct the disproportion that we see here and influence, exert some influence on the president. Peter, you will answer for everyone. Well, I should say that we have exert no influence on political decision. That's not our business. We live in the reality the way it is. Back in the 1990s, business tried to do that. I believe that was deeply wrong, and the situation in Ukraine is not our business at all. Well, naturally, we have money there, but we live in the current political reality, and which is guided by the choice of the leaders and by people. Believe me that we exert no impact on that, and we should not do that. Well, just please give the microphone to ex-minister. Well, the Monroe Doctrine was mentioned, and for 6 years I was first deputy minister of foreign affairs, and for 6 years I was minister. Well, I should say that we had no difficulty in drafting it and in working with it. If you take European Union and NATO documents, you will read that Central Europe and Central and Eastern Europe are regions of special interest to these two blocks, and Russia is allowed to can have its national interest in these areas as well. So don't look for any. Well, don't have any fantasies about that. There was no doctrine whatsoever there. Second, separation of politics and business. I participated in negotiations on Jackson Vanik amendments, but well, it is impossible to tear them apart. Sanctions are political, but it has its impact on the economy. And here, again, we get to the idea of rules for the coming decades. We should prepare ourselves for the fact that it is the fact of life, and we live with that, we work with that, and so economic sanctions will have political consequences as well. Mr. Chernogursky.
Mr. Skidelsky's words on morality, democracy, and peace, or not complete peace. Yes, just on last year's Valdai Club, President Putin had told that Russia nowadays is defending the values that were defended once by European countries. And yes, it is meant gender philosophy, gay pride marches, voting of Russia in various United Nations committees on human rights, etc. Yes, the question is, Minister Lavrov told a few days ago that the issue is not Ukraine, the issue is to make out of Russia a Western country, but Russia as Western country is including all these values as I have told. Yes, the issue is how far this basing of Russian policy is okay.
I'll have to answer sometime.
Let's talk. I have 3 or 4 unhappy persons in the.
Raised Monroe Doctrine 3 times.
3 times. But believe me, we have much suffering people. Mr. Черногорский, позади вас. Да, позади вас. Да, да.
Right behind Mr. Черногорский. It looks like you wanted to. Well, Tama. Well, they will bring a microphone to you.
Panelists, 2 quick questions. The first one is related to the overall situation. We're facing a situation in which there will be growth in the coming years in the US and in China, and Russia and the EU will continue to oscillate between stagnation and recession. Given this background, my question is for Professor Skidelsky. Imagine a situation in which Keynes and Schumpeter would be still alive. What would be their pieces of advice to try to overcome this turmoil? And my second question is addressed to Cliff about the relation between sanction and Russian behavior. Imagine a situation in which today the sanction will be lifted. What will be the consequences from your point of view on the Russian behavior?
Go ahead.
Okay, maybe I could answer the second one, the last one first. I mean, what would Keynes and Schumpeter advise? Well, I think they'd almost certainly be against sanctions. Actually, I don't think they would have regarded them I don't think they would have regarded anything that has happened as sufficient for this interruption to the economic system which it brings about. However, I do want to query something that both Cliff and Peter have said, and that is that Russia, they've made Russia radioactive, the sanction. But Russia was pretty radioactive before sanctions ever came in. I mean, there was a reluctance to invest in Russia. The Russian state has never made a separation between politics and business, and it's simply it's part of what's wrong when Peter says business elite has nothing to say about politics. It leaves politics to the leadership, political leadership, and tries to do business. But of course, that is not recognized, that separation, by the Russian state. And there are many, many examples one can give that. Basically, the Russian economy is a rent-seeking economy. And unless you accept that point, one hasn't got to the beginning of the discussion. Actually, one is doing something subsidiary. Last point on Monroe Doctrine. What my point is that Russia has really retreated to a Monroe Doctrine as a defensive position with the failure of its attempts to create a wider European area. And because that's not happened, so it defends its core position, if you like. And so it is a Monroe Doctrine, and whether it calls it that or not. And it's not ideological, it is historical, it's ethnic, it's got religious elements in it, but they all constitute a Monroe Doctrine.
Спасибо. Professor Naumkin.
Professor Naumkin now. Vitaly Naumkin from Moscow. I have a brief comment to Mr. Skidelsky, Professor Skidelsky. I quite agree with you when you say that sanctions are against not only or aimed at complicating the life for the close circle of Putin, but also they are to influence the common people of Russia, to push them towards a riot and to the overthrow of the regime. But what I disagree with is that it's going to work. Let me give you one example. This year, in Crimea, they have an excellent harvest of wheat, 1,500,000 tons. Private ship owners, they're using different flags and they don't want to end up on the black list. I spoke with a couple of agrarians, agricultural businessmen who represent the interests of farmers. And they were blaming, they did not blame Putin, and they are not afraid to criticize our authorities for bureaucracy and so on. They are very angry at the West. They treated Europe nicely, but today I felt their hatred towards those who impose sanctions against us. They don't want to go to the streets against Putin. They want to hurt Europe and the West to make them bleed.
Discussion, but I have the following question. Because I agree with all negative impacts of the sanctions. Even more, you're giving incentive for deglobalization for other countries which are afraid if they're going to be next. My problem is, what is the way to react on attack on an order in an interdependent economic world? Because there is only one reason why the West put the sanctions, because we should have done something. It is not that you have objectives or no objectives, but basically giving medals to the people in Crimea was also not an option for us. And I do believe this is a problem about order. How the order based on a total economic interdependence function, and how you basically can react to this.
Please.
Cliff Kupchin, I'm with Eurasia Group. Some risk, I know. I'm going to try to provide a little balance here, I think. I mean, I don't think that most Americans or American elites want a weak Russia. I just don't agree with that. And this is mostly for Cliff. Since he's got my name, I feel like I can go after him a little bit. I don't think, this is just a list of points, which I think push you a little bit, I hope. I'm going to repeat it, yeah. I don't think that most American elites want a weak Russian economy. This is the president that brought us reset. That was to strengthen the Russian economy. And you know, I think there's a general consensus that a strong Russian economy is better for the world. The second point, I don't think this was a small number of people who made sanctions. It was a large number of people in the administration. Thank God the Congress, yes, was not involved with sanctions. Once you get Congress involved in sanctions, you can really never get rid of them. These are all executive orders. That's a good thing. Third, there's a strong consensus in the United States that Russia did something objectionable. I mean, what the hell are we supposed to do? I don't know. I don't agree. I don't, think it's, bombing Russia, that's absurd, especially for this president. This president bombs under extreme humanitarian duress, ISIS in Libya. This president is not very aggressive, and he's been criticized for that, I think, correctly. Finally, there's a lot of pain being inflicted on both the European and the American economies. It's not just this economy. So that I think it's a much more nuanced discussion than we have maybe reflected so far. Thank you.
Одна просьба. Есть кто-то в зале, кого...
Is there anyone in the room whom I have forgotten? You're next, and then here.
Mangot from the University of Innsbruck in Austria. I have a brief comment. I was very impressed by the presentation of Professor Geddy and the distinction he makes between the impact of sanctions and the effect of sanctions. And what we have seen is a great deal of impact, but no effects of the sanctions in terms of altering Russia's behavior. But what I want to point to is, having had very intensive talks with members of the European External Action Service and with political directors of various European foreign ministers, there's a growing narrative among them that the Minsk Protocol of September the 5th is the consequence of the sanctions imposed by the European Union at the end of July. And I think this is deeply wrong. I would say what we all know is that the intervention of Russian regular troops on the side of the rebels to push back the anti-terrorist operation and to create new facts on the ground, and the realization of President Poroshenko that there is no chance for him winning this conflict by military means, made it possible to have the Minsk Protocol signed on September the 5th. But still, there's that narrative, and I think this narrative will prevail, and the Europeans point to themselves as being the arbiters of the truce signed on September the 5th. Thank you.
Один записавшийся, потом у нас будет несколько минут для панели ответить.
Just one more person, and we'll have some minutes for the panel to respond to what they've heard. Mr. Mamedov from Moscow. Okay, Leonid, I have a question to you. We are having this conflict, but is there any role that G20 may play in this? Thank you. Dmitry Suslov from the High School of Economics about the Monroe Doctrine. I'll be quick. Paradoxically, it became one of the topics that we discuss, whether it's normal or whether it's a deviation in the current system of international relations. Angela Stent said that the US was not using the Monroe Doctrine and cited unfriendly country in the Caribbean basin, but it's not a very convincing document for two reasons. Number one, policy of the US is still aimed at transforming those countries. They don't think it's normal, the existence of Venezuela, Ecuador, and Cuba. And the US is the only country in the world with global involvement. They do have different interests, different hierarchy of interests, different main priorities. But if it happens that the US will choose a retrenchment strategy and will reject a global presence, the importance of Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Ecuador in the policy of the US will immediately increase and will be as important as Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova for Russia. Whether it's a deviation or not, how the desire of Russia to create a Moscow-oriented order in the post-Soviet state and to limit the geopolitical, geoeconomic presence of other centers of power, how is it different from the strategy of China towards Eastern and Southeastern Asia? Militarily and economically, China is conducting the very same policy. How is it different from the desire of India to minimize the military presence of the US in the Indian Ocean, in spite of all the common interests of India and the US against China? And this list may be continued. How different is it from the policy of Brazil in Latin America? And this is one of the main differences when we talk about rules that we use. According to Russia's opinion and other centers of power opinion, the Monroe Doctrine, not in its original form, but in the modernized form, is the future normality of foreign relations in the 21st century. Mr. Delagin, and I saw somebody else's hand up there. These last comments here. I want to ask a question to all the panelists. How can you explain such a sharp and dramatic change of attitude of the West to Nazism? 2 years ago, Nuremberg tribunal decisions were active that Nazism was wrong. Now there is systemic support of Nazism in Ukraine. When we were hoping for Minsk agreements, they say, the Romans said after does not mean in consequence of, but formally It does not work. Okay, one more question, and we will give the time to the panelists.
And from National University of Singapore. And Cliff's explanation about sanctions is very refreshing and very good. But I was in Berlin for about 2 months as a Bosch Fund fellow, and I engaged a lot of people in there. I feel that sanction can have other two purposes. First is to send a strong message to President Putin that his policy, the way he handles Ukraine crisis, is not acceptable. The second purpose, like it or not, is a solidarity. That is, all those countries in Europe, Japan included, we know Japan invested a lot in Russia, but now it's all gone, of course. It's a solid solidarity that all those countries will stand together against this kind of policy. So maybe in this kind of understanding, the symbolic significance is more important than real consequence. Thank you.
Спасибо большое. Пока у нас еще не закончилось.
While we still have time, let me thank, not to forget that later, thank you for being so disciplined. We set the records of the number of comments and presentations in my memory. I have not forgotten anyone. Okay. Would you like to respond, any of you?
I'm sacrificing myself, but for the public good. Sanctions are working. Sanctions are working. Please go ahead.
No, I've said what I wanted to say about sanctions. I just want to concentrate on one thing. Yes, the Monroe Doctrine is alive and well. It's quite everywhere. Any power that is in a position to do so will enforce some sort of Monroe Doctrine. And there's only a few that can. And then it's the costs of doing so. The costs of America from having a Monroe Doctrine are actually quite small. The cost to other powers may be a lot larger. To my mind, the Monroe Doctrine marks the failure of multipolarity as an alternative to unipolarity. It's just a retreat from the exaggerated hopes of a genuine unipolar world in the sense of equal centers of attraction. So it's a defense to it's a retreat to your core positions that you feel you cannot give up, whatever happens. I think it's a time that the Monroe Doctrine became was discussed by academics as a realistic version of the old balance of power. I mean, because that's what it is. And yet people are very, very reluctant to talk about it because it does conflict with the accepted norms of state sovereignty and the rule of law. And Russia's seizure of Crimea was in breach of the rule of law, as has been accepted by most countries. It's as simple as that.
Cliff?
Yep. Well, I guess I do have to talk about sanctions. That's the only thing people ask me about. The basic question of sanctions, looking at it from a Western standpoint, is yes, we had to do something. You can't just sit by and do nothing. So you have to do something. You can't use military force. What else can you do? You can issue proclamations of displeasure, but they would be a message, but they wouldn't be a strong message. So sanctions are a message, exactly as Jing said. They have to have some negative impact, or otherwise it's a meaningless message. I'm not saying sanctions are necessarily to be ruled out as a means of doing something. But what I wanted to do is indicate what I don't think has been fully appreciated is the risks of sanctions and the cost of sanctions to us. I don't think the sanctions have had any impact on the U.S. economy to speak of. I'm talking about the real threats to the world, to the US, and to other parts of the world, which are the future Russia, a Russia that would be much, much worse than the Russia we don't seem to like at all right now. And a successor regime that would be much worse than Putin for the West. And then, as I said, the whole policy of reducing Russia's interdependence, its dependence on the world financial system, having consequences, potential consequences that I don't think are fully appreciated. The question that Ivan raises of, how do you react? What do you do? I mean, I don't have the magic bullet answer to that. It really has to be discussed. But in that discussion, my point is simply, let's have a full evaluation of the dangers and the risks of this particular tool or weapon that we try to use to express our displeasure, our complete unacceptance of certain ways of breaking the rules and behaving in the international context.
Three quick points. First, looking at it historically, sanctions may work against small, vulnerable states. But historically, sanctions have never worked against any important state. Nobody can cite a single example where sanctions have worked against an important state. On the contrary, sanctions against an important state have made military conflict more inevitable. Second point, that business cannot be separated from politics is apparent from one contemporary fact, that booming trade between countries has only accelerated political rivalries. If you look at Asia, the danger of military conflict is most apparent between countries that boast booming trade. Point number 3, Western foreign policy is far from being driven by a mission to promote democracy or human rights. Some of the most repressive regimes in the world are propped up by Western states. Think of Saudi Arabia. In fact, some of the recent pro-democracy movements that have been suppressed, that suppression has happened with the help of the West. Again, I'll just mention one example, Bahrain. Democracy promotion, unfortunately, has become a political tool to be used selectively to further geopolitical interests. And that exactly is the problem with sanctions. If sanctions were applied on the basis of certain fair play, and there was a certain consistency to sanctions, there would be wider international acceptance. Russia is not the only country, by the way, that has challenged the territorial integrity of another state in recent years. We tend to be so focused on one country, we tend to forget the bigger picture and how sanctions are being applied selectively. Sanctity of existing frontiers certainly has become an important or a very powerful global norm. But Russia is not the only country challenging that global norm. In other cases where that norm has been challenged and breached, no attempt has been made to apply sanctions. This goes to show that, like democracy promotion, application of sanctions is a geopolitical tool that only divides the world, that fails to win international consensus.
Осталось 3 минуты.
Well, 3 minutes left for me. Well, can you please download my presentation and especially my title? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Oh, God's sake.
Island. Все знают историю острова.
You probably all know the history of Easter Island, and I will stick to this slide and will tell you about my impressions. I thought that the discussion would be very light and very friendly, dedicated to economy, and rather we were discussing heavy and grave political problems, problems which are not resolved by the world. People who are taking tactical decisions in terms of the sanctions, they forget that you may change everything every day in politics. So, for instance, on Monday you love this president, on Tuesday you stop loving him, and for instance, we have one of the country in Latin America when, for instance, the president is deemed to be dictator on Monday and then romantic on Tuesday, etc. But sanctions will slow down the economic growth everywhere in the world. And Cliff, right now Americans certainly are not affected by the sanctions, but they will feel that, and they will never even understand that they were affected by their own sanctions. And certainly the problems in the Middle East are not resolved, they are exacerbated. And these sanctions, the economic situation, regardless of who is to be blamed for that, would result in the decrease in the certainty, and people do not know in the United States where their kids are going to work, whether in Russia or in the United States or in Europe. People do not know where to invest. In credit crunch, there is no access to loans, and because of the nervousness of the atmospheres and the sanctions, the economic growth is slowed down, and next stage is merging the next stage of the economic crunch, and we are approaching the, for instance, slowdown of the economic growth globally. For instance, someone failed to get money from Peter Arvin, then the economic menace from Europe shifts to Singapore. And as far as I have actually a presentation, we can just distribute it, disseminate it, but I would like to focus on several items. For instance, the Russian business is affected by the sanctions, and as far as I'm quite old and I remember the Soviet-era sanctions, let me tell you about the Soviet propaganda. Who were the bad guys in the West? Pentagon, CIA, and certainly the tycoons or oligarchs, as we call them in Russia. So the rich ones, the military, and the spies. This was the Soviet-type propaganda. What about the Western propaganda? All the Soviets are bad, from bottom to the top. So they're strange, they are inadequate, so they're all bad. What we see now. So what radioactive Russia is? This is not just a political elite which was banned from going somewhere. So we include here the financial elites, and I agree with Mr. Getty, who says that Russia should avoid this trap of, for instance, 15,000 per capita. We have an inequality of a Latin nature, or an Argentinian type of gap between the rich and poor. And we are not integrating at the level of 15,000, and this is actually relevant to all the BRICS nations. Instead, we are frozen at this very stage, and the propaganda again and again hits more and more people. My students are affected by this propaganda. Some universities, actually, they even stop working with Russia. They curtail their budgets aimed at Russia. So more R&D institutes stop investigating into the Russian situation, and they no longer understand the Russian situation. But actually, we are used to living in such a kind of an isolation. So immediately something is triggered in our heads. And let me draw an example of a happy end in an American movie. So a good guy would kill the bad guy, and after that he would kiss his beloved girl and steps on the corpse of a bad guy. So, and that's a happy end. So what's the historically typical end of the movie in the Soviet Union? So a good guy would kill the bad guy, but good guys will never survive, so he also would be killed. So a girl would cry because her good guy would be killed, but everyone around would be happy. Why? Because he died for the country, in the name of the country, for the sake of the country. So this is what is triggered immediately in our heads. Good guys will never survive. People's mentality cannot be calculated even using the personal computers, and sometimes in the West we are told, so look, I have 2 castles and 3 pawns and for instance 1 queen, so you lost. But I will tell him so. I have just 1 pawn, but I will immediately hit your king, for instance, and explode everything. And let me spill the beans to our American colleagues. This is an open secret, actually, but this is my everyday experience. So someone would approach me, someone from a big emerging nation, and tell me that's good that Mr. Putin again would teach a lesson to the Americans, and actually, but the situation in Ukraine, this is something excessive. So you have exaggerated your power. That's the kind of rhetoric I see every day. And certainly, we wrote about the elites, that they have potential and power, and a German businessmen will come and say that we're against sanctions, but if there is a political instruction, we'll certainly fulfill this instruction. Okay, so let's speak about the intellectual elite. So I spoke about propaganda already. And let me end with a joke, which I usually tell when in the West. You all know Casablanca movie. This is the best of the best movies, judging by all the ratings. This is due to the fact that she didn't know the end of the movie, and she was told to act as if she may end with one guy and with the other guy. But there is a remarkable moment when a French captain, when one of the officers was killed, he tells his subordinates, round up usual suspects. And so someone just out of the street would be arrested. And now we see that the Russians are the usual suspects. Whatever happens, for instance, if somewhere in the beach you can see the caterpillar tracks, you will immediately guess that somewhere you can find a Russian submarine or U-boat. My first visit to the United States was in 1979, and I was asked, was it me who killed Kennedy? Although I was so young that I could not do that. And I told those who asked this question, you did yourself. And then I was asked whether I attempted the assassination of the Pope. And I used to be an exchange student for many years. And all of a sudden I found myself in quite a familiar atmosphere, sanctions. And now, on behalf of the usual suspects, the Russians, I call this meeting adjourned.